Lucia Melloni.
One of my deepest pleasures is that I actually had the chance to work with her. So there's nothing nicer than having, one of the people that you admire the most introducing you. I think this is too loud, isn't it? No, it's okay. All right. So I thought deeply about how to frame this talk, right? A, because I'm an organizer, but also because I deeply admire your work. And I deeply admire it because I think that when I was back in Chile, it gave me an entry into thinking that I could think about this problem, So it was really an eye-opener back in the day. So I thought on the one hand, looking at the work back in the field, we're going to move from philosophy to the neuroscience of consciousness. I don't do philosophy, but I do brains. So and what I want to do today a little bit is how far have we got with the, brain program, and what are the challenges that we have encountered along the way, and what are perhaps the ones that we will continue to encounter in the future if some of the things that we're doing today continue to be done as opposed to changing our minds. So this is what you did this morning. You said the science of consciousness, what it was the different decades. So I thought, okay, and everyone in the morning started with an agenda. I never do that, but I thought, okay, perhaps actually I should do it. So that's what's going to be in the menu today. I'll talk a little bit about the neural correlates of consciousness and how far we have got. Then a little bit about theories. Is there a way to find one, or at least to rule out some alternatives? And I will end up with the program that, Dave talked about, the 2020, which is the distribution problem. And in particular, I will talk about human consciousness and how can we escape our own ruler. So this is back in 1996. And I want to, for all of the students who are here, I thought, and I will actually take some of the quotes from that book, because I still think that they are as true as they were back then today. So let me read you a couple of them. Conscious experience is at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious. There is nothing we know about more directly than consciousness, but it is far from clear how to reconcile it with everything else we know. Then what is central to consciousness, at least, in the most interesting sense, is experience. But this is not a definition. At best, it is clarification. Why does it exist? What does it do? How could it be possible? How could it possibly arise from lumpy gray matter? We know consciousness far from intimately, but we know the rest of the world. But we understand the rest of the world far better than we understand consciousness. I am an optimist about consciousness, not a pessimist. I think that we might eventually have a theory. And in this book, I look for one, but we cannot expect finding a theory of consciousness to be easy. It's not going to be cheap. And he goes on and says, in developing my account of consciousness, I've tried to obey a number of constraints. The first and foremost is to take consciousness seriously. The easiest way to develop a theory of consciousness is to deny its existence, or to redefine the phenomenon in need of explanation as something that it's not. This usually leads to an elegant theory, but the problem does not go away. Throughout this book, I have assumed that consciousness exists and that to redefine the problem as that of explaining how certain cognitive or behavioral functions are performed is unacceptable. This is what I mean by taking consciousness seriously. And this is 1996, and I think that I try to highlight a number of those points because I think that the discussions that we have up until these days are exactly back on the ones that you highlighted back in the day. But he did not only do that. I actually found a little bit of, some of his, talks, which I still recommend you to guys go and check. In 1994, he already, talked to us about the heart problem. But then the one that, set me up, for research was this one. How can one search the neural correlates of consciousness? It would be a lot easier if we had a conscious meter. And the beauty is that he actually gave us one, right? So here's Dave, searching, and he found his own experience. Sadly, for some reason, he couldn't find the one of Dan Dennett. I don't know why, but he just couldn't. And this is our modern version of the conscious meter. We put people, like in the scanner. And fast forward in 30 years, this is where we are at, I think, at least in the neuroscience of consciousness. We have done neural correlates, we have done theories of consciousness, we have done disorders of consciousness. So let me start with the neural correlate of consciousness. So he already talked about how it was defined by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch. Search for the minimum neural mechanism jointly sufficient for any conscious perception, the NCC, for every conscious percept. There will be an NCC. Inducing the NCC will induce the perception. Inactivating the NCC will eliminate it. And he was very courageous. He even said, you know what, let's just make a bet. Are we going to fund it? And he said, no, we won't. And Christoph, who is very courageous as well, said, of course we will, in 30 years' time we should. Unfortunately, Liad and Itai did a meta-analysis of all of the research that was done between the 2000 and 2020. And as you can see here, we have converged on the entire brain. Well, no, that's not true. We rule out the cerebellum. Actually, that's also not true. It's just that the people don't report what the cerebellum does. So actually, we haven't quite, ruled anything, right? And I've written why this program, I think, has problems. This is not, this is for another talk. But it wasn't surprising, I think. So Dave, won, and Christoph had to concede that, he had lost. So if we are not going to fight the neural correlates, then he had given us another alternative. So his book was In Search of a Fundamental Theory, right? So he said, okay, we need theories. The neural correlate is not going to take us that far. Let's, go for theories. But then the question is, which one? Because the ones that we have look to me as very, very myopic. They trace a cartography of the brain depending on what they want and what they like. And this is, again, like the beautiful work of Itai Jaron and Liad, where they actually look at, what happened in the past 20 years, and if you look for which areas of the brain light up depending on the theories, you end up with what the theories predict, a beautiful confirmation bias. So, it's kind of like not great. And irrespective of that, one would actually argue, so if we had 20 or almost 30 years of theories, why are we not converging on a unifying theory? If we have learned anything, we should have, right? And back in the day when Itai was putting this paper together, so if you take everything together, it seems as if every theory is advancing. But one of the things that I ask Itai, I say, what happens if you actually break it down over time? Because if this is like evolution, some should be dying, some should be, evolution literally, promote certain things and not promote others, right? Here, what you actually see is that it's promoting everything, right? And the challenges are almost inexistent. Now, we knew from Walter Mitchell, he's the candy or the marshmallow person, that this is known in psychology. So already in 2008, he told us about the toothbrush problem. Psychologists treat other people's theories like toothbrushes. No self-respecting person wants to use anyone else's. So we knew that was going to happen, right? So the question is, how can we know which theories are better when we don't have any standard procedure to rule theories, right? Actually, we do have one. And this was Max Planck. He says, well, you just let people die, and the ideas die with them, right? So we just need to let time pass. That, unfortunately, I'm very, very, very impatient. So if I want to know the answer, that's not gonna cut it. So what about an alternative? And that's the one that Danny Kahneman proposed. It's called adversarial collaboration. So instead of letting people die, you just put ideas to compete, and you try to have people to resolve their disagreements and look for which ones are the most prominent ideas or the ones that actually really survive a stress test. He also mentioned that these are the mechanisms for people to change their mind. That's important because back in the day when we started the journey in 2018, when we sat down at the Allen Institute, Dave sitting there, Liad sitting there, and a bunch of other people, including, of course, Michael Pitts, but Christoph, Stan, Julio, Hagwan Lau. The idea was in those 2 days to come up with some ideas to, compare these theories and actually find the one that survives, right? And you can see here the sketches of the things that we actually did back in the day. For reasons that I'm not going to go into, we started with 3 theories. We ended up in 2. Sometimes it's actually better to have a duo than a trio, so we ended up in a duo. So what was the duo? It was, we were going to test two theories. One is integrated information theory by Lucia Melloni and Christoph Koch, and the other one is global neural workspace theory by Stanislas Dehaene and Lionel Nakache and Jean-Pierre Changeux, and of course Bernie Bars. And they cannot differ more. Like the one thing that you can actually think about is that one is about how a message is passed, like across regions, and how like fame in the brain really happens. So if you are conscious, then this content gets spread over your entire brain. And in the other case, they think Julia thinks that it cannot be, a message that is passed is a cause-effect structure. So these are very different theories in how they are built, and also in their ontologies. But nonetheless, we thought, okay, let's just try at least to find out, like how they might differ. And we came up with two experiments. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about experiment one, which is the one that we already published. And the idea was super simple. Let's look for a necessity test. What is a necessity means like, what are the mechanisms that really underlie our rich sensory conscious experience, right? And a part of that is how am I just seeing you and you're not disappearing from my field of view. And the second one was more or less sufficiency test. So in this case, like what is the distinction between seen versus unseen? And that's a little bit more complicated. Whoops. Oh, I guess that, it wasn't Tobias' computer. Well, it's back. It was zombie for just a split second. And the second one is about seen versus unseen stimuli. It's a really courageous experiment because it's a full new video game, but it's, of course, much more complicated, and so on. And the first experiment started with this intuition of the Mona Lisa. Why the intuition of the Mona Lisa? Because every time we have an experience, we see, for instance, that this is a face and not a cat. We see that this is the Mona Lisa and not any other women. We see, for instance, that it has an orientation. So it's looking, like to the left, or like to one orientation and not to the front. We also see that, like it's there. If we don't close our eyes, the Mona Lisa is still there. So it's really built on this simple idea that our experience is extremely rich. It has all of this content, and there has to be a place in the brain that explains that. Now, it just happens to be the case that these two theories tend to differ between the explanations. They will tell you in a minute, how they differ on that. The important point to take is that one of the things that we really tried our best was to test this series with the strongest methods we could at the time. Why? Because we were worried that whatever results we get, then the proponents of the series will say, like, well, but what happened if you had tested this and if you had tested that? So we thought, okay, let's just go with the whole arsenal of methods that we have in human neuroscience. In this case, fMRI, magnetoencephalography, electroencephalography, and even electrodes implanted in people's brains. So we literally tried our best. And we came up with 3 predictions for at least this particular test. What are the contents of consciousness? So where in the brain can we find information about the contents? The second one is the maintenance. What are the mechanisms responsible for enduring a stimulus in time? And the last one is what are the patterns of connectivity that these two theories predict? I will not tell you all of the different results because I want to get to other parts, but I just want to show you that, in short, I'm only going to show you the challenges. Why? Because I think that the challenges are informative, the passes are not, right? You can actually find a reason why that may not necessarily be only talking about consciousness, it could also be unconscious, but the point is that if there is a challenge, this was a sufficiency test. So whatever the theory was proposing, if it's not there, it really invalidates the theory. So what is the difference? So for GNW, if you have a stimulus that stays in your mind for a long time, you should have an ignition at the beginning, an ignition at the end, and it should actually be concomitant with the length of that duration. In the case of IAT, they say, no, you need a cause-effect structure that is the same as what you are perceiving. Therefore, you have to have the same activity and the same connectivity all the time for that cause-effect structure to be there. Right? So we look for 2 different signatures in the brain, so you can think that these 2 onset responses for GNW, these sustained responses for IAT, and then the representational similarities, where information should be in the brain. And in this case, in the case of GNW, it should just be only sparse and not sustained. Right? I will only go to GNW. Why? Because at least for this prediction, IAT passed, so it's actually not that informative. So what GNW was predicting was that there should be an onset and an offset. And what you can see here is that we have a very nice onset in many, many, many electrodes, but there is actually no offset here. there is an onset here, and the offset is actually not there. This is irrespective of whether we look at, these are what I forgot to mention. So these are electrodes in prefrontal cortex in the area in which G and W had predicted this pattern to be present. We had over 100 electrodes, that actually are responsive, but none of them has an offset response. But one, which is this guy here that you can see, the problem is that that response was too early. So it actually is not concomitant to what the theory had predicted. Now it's good for us because it tells us that if that pattern had been there, we would have found it. So it's a sanity check for us. It's bad for the theory, but for us it's actually pretty good, right? So we can say it only onset, no offset, the theory fails. Now Stan raised an important counter-argument and says, well, but what if the participants were not aware of the offset of the stimulus, right? I thought it was implausible, but I said, you know what, I will give you the benefit of the doubt, so we will test it. So we asked him, how will you test that? And then he said very clearly, I will use the so-called refractory period. What does that mean is that if you have a stimulus in your conscious, you cannot have another content at the same time. So you have to wait until the next information actually comes into it, right? And then by virtue of doing that, if you have a psychological refractory period, you can actually test whether or not the stimulus was there. So what he predicted was, I want you to only consider this. So if the subjects had seen the stimulus or had maintained the stimulus in consciousness, we would have a pattern like this. If they had not seen the offset or they had not been conscious of the offset, we would see no differences. I want you to just keep that prediction in mind because that's the key point. What did we observe behaviorally? We observed a psychological refractory period at the onset as well as at the offset, both when we had the target, the task-relevant stimulus, and the task-irrelevant stimulus. So what that tells us is that at least there is some indication that the subjects were conscious of the offset. So we cannot just say that the theory failed, because the subjects were not conscious of the offset. All right, secondly, we tested also which patterns of brain activity were concomitant with the different theories. IIT and GNW make different predictions. For GNW, there should be a phasic response between prefrontal cortex and high-level visual cortex. So synchrony should be only very transient and only at the beginning of the experience. Whereas for IIT, we should have synchrony between B1 and B2 and high-level visual areas, and that should be sustained. This is important because if it's not sustained, the theory doesn't pass. What did we find? Very nice. So if you do the so-called psychophysiological interactions in fMRI, so you put the seed in higher-order visual areas, you actually recover both the patterns of IIT, so V1, and the patterns of GNW. So that's great. So this means that we actually have those connections, right? The problem is that when you don't do intracranial recordings and you look for the temporal profile, we do not find the sustained response that IIT was predicting. And therefore, IIT is challenged. This is just a long story short to tell you that, at least in the experiment number 1 and also in experiment number 2, which I'm not going to show you now, we have a number of challenges for both of the theories. So what we know from today is that they do need revisions, and that I think that is unquestionable. This has been a project that we have been running since 2018. I think the largest and probably the most tiring Liad that we have both run. But we are actually very proud of it because we have achieved not only publishing the experiment number 1, but we released all of the data that are now in your, if you go here, you will actually see that every single fMRI, EMG, intracranial eye tracking is already there, for your perusal. So if you have your theory, go test it on those data, ideally pre-register, because it's possible that once you see the data, then you will change your mind. So ideally pre-register it. And Ronnie and I and others, and Stefan are running the so-called Consciousness Common now at the ASSC. And this is an invitation to everyone, and in particular to the early career investigators. Because, let's face it, science is really expensive, and having this data is really, really difficult. So our hope is that by collecting data from many, many different labs, instead of making us spending money on acquiring new data, we could now spend money on testing hypotheses on the data that we already have there. So the idea is to really make, ideally, a very big repository where everyone can really contribute and then test their own preferred ideas. It takes a lot of effort. It's not easy to share data, but I really think that if we do that, then we will be able to test our ideas in a much better way. And hopefully experiment 2 will be ready by, the 3rd of July, if time, if we can keep our own promises. All right, now what was interesting is that Daniel Kahneman had actually been thinking of adversarial collaborations as ways to change everybody's mind. And it was interesting because we invited him halfway to our consortium to inspire us. Like that was my hope, that he would inspire us, on working on these adversarial collaborations. And then Danny comes and tells us, well, you know what? I've been working on this thing for like the past 20 years, and I've come to realize that I made up my mind when I was 20, and ever since I've never changed my mind in nothing that is substantial. So that was like, well, and I think that we all thought, I don't know about Juliet, but I thought, you know what, he's just saying this, like, but the field will definitely change their mind, like he's just, he's just an oddity, right? He also told us about the so-called 15 IQ point advantage, which means that once you see the result, then you can explain them away. Hindsight effect, right? At least the one that stuck to me was the one on that people don't change their mind. And I really thought, deep down, that he was wrong. And I really wanted him to be wrong, right? But for a reason, you win a Nobel Prize, right? So I was wrong, and he was right. Why was he right and I was wrong? Because the moment we released the data, the most significant part of this adversarial collaboration was unleashing the unconscious of the whole conscious, community. So there was the first thing that, we thought that we had debunked IIT, but people thought that IIT was actually pseudoscience, right? So that was kind of harsh because we thought they had already proven it wrong, right? Whereas people were calling it pseudoscience. So that was strange. Either not testable, but we just tested it. So that kind of it didn't really make sense. So that was kind of my experience at the moment. Was like, what? This just can't be true. I've spent I don't know how many years trying to get this done, and we are just pseudoscience. And then at some point, it's good to look back in time, because I realized that there was this book, that was interesting. So it was 100 authors that each of them wrote a particular paper. So it wasn't 100 authors that wrote 300 words, but it was 100 authors writing 100 different papers, right? But I thought, okay, that's great, because 100 years later, by inflation, we got 124 authors, and he got 100, right? So that's kind of it checks. But then he actually had this answer. It's why 100 if one would have been enough to prove me wrong? And he was right, because some debates just need data. And if you have a proper theory that makes quantitative predictions that are very specific, like in his case, a very small curvature of the sun in an eclipse, you can actually prove him right. And these are the kind of theories that one day we need to have in consciousness. Not theories that say prefrontal, more, less, left, right. We need theories that tell us that, it's 0.5, right? And then that's going to be a true theory, right? So I'm not sure, they were definitely not where they were. So this adversarial collaboration was possible because the theory was very well developed with causal, interactions and so on. So my take of this whole enterprise after, almost 10 years is that what we actually need is a deep dive into metaphysics. And why? Is because ultimately these two people, or these two camps are just a very strong metaphysical disputes, right? And I think that you can, put this in. These are, by the way, the players back in the day at the Allen Institute. And Julia actually puts it very clearly here. So this is a clash of two paradigms. If you're a computational functionalist versus not, then of course things are going to look very different. And what is sobering is that Dave had actually thought about this already back in the book, right? He said, you need to have a commitment, to actually start with the theory. And he was saying, he was very bold and said, materialism is beautiful and compelling view of the world, but to account for consciousness, we have to go beyond the resources it provides, right? And so he was just saying, we need to start, you need to treat consciousness like physics, like something very fundamental. And he started by saying, like, this is my, metaphysical commitment, and from there on, like, we can move. So after these 10 years, I came to understand that we need to just come out of the closet, and for every neuroscientist, at least, we need to understand where people stand, because otherwise we will just talk, run experiments, collect data, and we will never, ever, 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 come to a true conclusion. So I think that we really need to sit down and understand. So if we have kids on, like the illusionism, like perhaps you're right. And if these are just two different paradigms, we should necessarily, sit down and resolve those, right? Or at least find ways to think, like, okay, if I run my machine, this is how the data should look like. And if I run my machine, this is how, the data should look like, right? But start from there and really own, what we believe. So that was sobering, but at the same time, it was like, well, Danny had told me that people don't change their mind, and it's true, he was right. And David already had told us that, you needed a deep commitment on metaphysics. So I thought, we haven't quite learned much in the past 30 years. So we haven't ruled out the NCC. We haven't come up with good theories. We are definitely not like physics. And that was on the one hand sobering, but at the same time was like, okay. So, but what could it be if I have to make like a positive contribution as opposed to just be, like pessimist? If I want to be, optimist, what could it be different? And I thought, so what about we go back to his conscious meter, And why? Because when he talks about, when he gives this fantastic lecture, he's pointing at his brain, he's pointing at Dan's brain, and he's pointing at only human's brain in that conference, right? And I thought, that's interesting, right? Because, what we want to understand is which one of these people or systems or etc. has consciousness. So if we keep pointing this thing to humans, what are we going to find? It seemed to me like Darwin could not have understood evolution by only looking at mammals, right? So my deep insight from that was we have, for the past 30 years, really committed to the idea that we need to start with human consciousness. We are singular, we have very, particular access to this data, we are very, like important. And by the way, I also study language. Same thing in that field. We are so, like unique. The truth is that if you look at evolution, most things are not de novo, right? We are not, like most things are just continuous. So it just seems very strange that for the past 30 years, we have really thought that we are the center of the universe, right? And that we are going to measure infants, octopus, organoids, and AI based on our own ruler. And I want to be really, like explicit about this because there is some theories that just tell this very, very clearly. So IIT says, like, well, okay, so what do you need to do if you want to find out a theory? You introspect to characterize phenomenal structure. Then you formulate phenomenal properties in physical causal terms. Then you establish the identity, phenomenal structure, blah, blah, blah. Then you validate, and then you extrapolate. And where did you start? From me. That's great. I don't take myself I don't think that I'm that special, people. I really don't think that I'm that special. So I think that that's a big problem that we have. So the referent has become the ruler, and this I call the ruler problem. And I think this is a serious problem. And if we don't get out of our box, we are never going to get a science of consciousness. And at least this is my strong commitment at the moment. And this is not about being anthropocentric. It's about, like having methodological closure. It's not even, like thinking methodologically well, So I want to invite all of you to switch from this old question, like which system resembles adult humans closely enough to count as conscious, which I call like the 6 admission criteria or the classification problem, to this new question. So what forms of subjective experience are possible? And how do they differ across systems? So can we seek a map? And this is not a better test, this is not a better conscious meter, this is a different project. This is Darwin, We go and create a cartography. So this is what we have been doing so far. Are you conscious, are you not? Are you conscious, are you not? We put a meter, like Dan wasn't there. Well, what about we start from here? And what about we had started 30 years ago in thinking that we are not the center of the universe, in thinking that we need to find principles that are there across phylogeny and across ontogeny. Because I came to be something, and Claudia gave yesterday a fantastic talk, telling that, well, infants are a fantastic model. Why? Because we know that they will develop consciousness, right? No matter what, like we know for a fact, right? Because we got to have that. Why have we not started with infants? And then we can trace that as a trajectory, right? So my pitch to you guys is, can we not think of, this project, the cartographic project, and how could, and you would say, but how would that look like? We have no ideas. Well, I have some ideas on how to actually get that set up. And I will actually steal some of those, from Dave. So he says, what if we actually make some commitments? So experience is structured, and it has certain qualities. It has to have some gradation, some order. If it is random, then we're not going to find anything. But if it's not random, if it has some structure, then let's look for that structure. I think that, you are also very much on that thing. Now you would ask, what type of structure? Well, so we can actually start with hypotheses. And here, I want to say, I don't want to start from indicators, because indicators are already a commitment. I want to start from hypotheses, thinking that perhaps consciousness is something to do with agency, perhaps consciousness is something to do with being differentiated, perhaps something to do with being integrated. I don't know where those 5 properties of Giulio come out. I cannot validate them, but I want to validate them, right? So we start with this hypothesis about organization that have its place, and you can take whatever you like: differentiation, integration, temporally extended, affective weighted, embodied. Let's say at this moment, let's just be as open as we want. Admissive, right? Why? Because we want to test it. And now here's my pitch to you. How do we test it? What we have thought so far is that consciousness is an end point. We have thought about this as I am conscious, I am not. But in evolution is only about trajectories. And then, of course, you can, find a system. It will come out because it's, like a zombie, but comes in and out, so don't worry. In evolution, we have, yes, I am a being right now, but over the course of evolution, I was something as well, right? So now we need to find out the full dynamics. And once we actually put the dynamics and the endpoints, we think about a process and a thing, right? And here we actually can be agnostic by design. Like consciousness could be a natural kind, could be a homeostatic cluster, could be a familiar resemblance. I have no idea what it is. I will not make a commitment because what I don't know, I cannot make a science of unless I want to do confirmation bias, right? So I want us to keep open because we don't know what it is. It could be a natural kind, but what if it isn't, right? And now you would say, okay, but then how would you really do it? Well, here's my method. So what if we actually, for each of the candidate dimensions, we actually think of this as a set of constraints. So for any phenomenological property, they have to, of course, be there when we have perturbations, but also for animals that are actually close to us, they should actually have more resemblance. We should also have a check on the cross-architecture. So the brains are also put a constraint, right? And development. So things now should have a similar trajectory in development as well, right? So think of, take a monkey, it should be similar to me in development and as an endpoint than perhaps an octopus, right? And by virtue of doing that, you can, backtrack how many of these properties are similar or not. And then you can say, okay, how many of these dimensions check across my different set of constraints? And then say, okay, this becomes more likely than this dimension, for instance, because one checks more of the constraints than the other, right? This is something that, Urani, who is here, and I have been thinking about it. And again, we stole this idea from Thingberg. I'm not thinking anything new. I think that when these guys were doing ethology, he said, well, if I want to explain animals' behavior, I need to understand the mechanism, I need to understand the development, the phylogeny and the evolution, and the function. And only with these 4, I have a proper understanding, right? Now, what I think is interesting from us in consciousness is that we have been thinking that if we do mechanism, we're done, right? And I really want to say, no, I don't think we will be done. I think a proper explanation will take to understand what is its function, if there is one, but also, what happens in phylogeny, right? And take that as a strong constraint, right? And my hope is that, invite you to this Darwinian, move, right? Go take the beagle, and just sample the world, and sample the world with your eyes wide open. Because otherwise, we will do more of the confirmation bias, and we have plenty of evidence right now. And we will not get where we want to go. I mean, we will get somewhere, but we will get to what you thought it was not the thing as such, right? And then, we have done 30 years of that. So hopefully the next 30 years we learn something, and we will not do that. We will make other mistakes, but at least not those, right? And why, and my pitch to you guys is, ultimately, we want to understand all of these different systems. And we don't want to just exclude them because we don't like them, or because they just don't resemble to us, or because they, I don't know, to me, ChatGPT doesn't seem conscious. But who am I to rule that this is, I honestly feel that, I cannot be the one who makes that judgment. We need a theory, but we need a theory that is actually on good standing, So we need good data, but we need good thinking, I would say. Because we need to get it right and not to be right. And on that note, one of the things that we did in the past, I think, 4 years, with all of the colleagues, in this picture, is to create a compendium on the study of consciousness. And the idea here was, let's trade the history of consciousness, the metaphysical issues, the theories, what do we know in humans, what do we know in animals, what do we know in plants, what do we know in societies, what do we know in AI, what do we not know? And this, I take it, we really try to be as open in our views as possible, because we want the next generation to read the thing in its full diversity. And I think at this conference we try to bring that, and I think that in general we need to bring this project for everyone else. And with that, I also want to give a big shout out to Lea, who is in the audience, and Savio, who were the two who made the volume possible, because they read all of the chapters, corrected the mistakes, and all of the authors, who have stood with us, for this long period. You have some flyers there, so just take them home, and we call it Horizons Mind, because we really want to improve, or opens people's mind, right? And we want to make it as a living system, So the idea is that, we will incorporate more chapters and ideally discussions also within the website. So, and with all of that, thank you, Dave, for your sharp and generous mind, for the illuminating pathways, for bringing consciousness back, and for your support and friendship, and for the metaphysical captain, and also the people from Cogitate, and the people in my lab, and all of you guys also. Thank you.